And welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. My guest for this show is Bill Blum. He's a retired judge and a lawyer in Los Angeles. He's a lecturer at the University of Southern California, Annenberg, for communication. He writes regularly on law and politics and is the author of 3 widely acclaimed legal thrillers, Prejudicial Error, The Last Appeal, and The Face of Justice. Great to have you on the show. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
So you have an article that says that Trump exploited the legal infrastructure to advance fascism in America. And then you list a bunch of different ways that that's happened. Just to run through it quickly, the first is the Electoral College, the constitutional design of the Senate, abuse of executive orders, the National Emergencies Act, Scapegoating of Immigrants, the transformation of the Department of Homeland Security into a Mobile Paramilitary Force, abuse of the Pardon Power, Eroding Justice Department Independence, voter suppression. So let's get into it. Tell us a little bit more about these. Which is the worst?
Well, let me back up just a moment. I've been following Donald Trump very closely as a columnist since 2015 when he announced his campaign. And he began with attacks on immigrants, and in the legal realm floated the idea of opening up our libel laws to overturn New York Times versus Sullivan, the Supreme Court decision that basically protects the press in this country from defamation lawsuits brought by public figures and public officials. And when he also called for ending birthright citizenship. So I try to warn everyone of the dangers of this man. And at that time, no one thought that he had a prayer of becoming president. And then as I studied him more closely and wanted to anchor him in the wider context of geopolitics, I began thinking about Trump in terms of his relationship to fascism as a 20th century movement, and now 21st century movement. And I and many others began to debate the question, is Donald Trump a fascist or is he just a garden variety demagogue?
So
that's where we came in. Well, you have to start with the definition of what is fascism. And fascism is a fuzzy concept, and it's often very much overused and abused as a notion. And for that reason, you have to be careful about it. And people have been slow to embrace the idea that Donald Trump's a fascist. So just as you would in a legal brief, you start out with a rule of law, and here you start out with a definition. Where do you go for a definition of fascism? You go certain places to certain experts like Robert Paxton. You go to Umberto Eco. And more recently, for purposes of this article, I took a definition that Sarah Churchwell, who's a professor at the University of London, offered in a New York Review of Books essay. And what these authors tell us is that fascism is a very malleable concept, and that it's really a form of political behavior, a kind of hyper-nationalism, a form of capitalist ideology at the same time, and it varies from place to place and time to time. So I think that if you're looking for a checklist of fascist traits, start with Umberto Eco's 14 common characteristics of fascism in his famous 1995 New York Review of Books essay titled You Are for Eternal or Original Fascism. And that checklist, I think, is really illuminating when you apply it to Donald Trump.
Okay. Well, can you tell us a little bit? What are some?
Sure. Let me just tick them off, and I'll read. You have a cult of traditionalism, a rejection of modernism, a cult of action for its own sake, and a distrust of intellectualism, a framing of disagreement or opposition as treasonous, a fear of difference. Fascism is racist by definition, an appeal to a frustrated middle class, either due to economic or political pressures from both above and below, an obsession with plots and machinations of the movement's identified enemies, a requirement that said enemies be simultaneously seen as omnipotent and weak, conniving and cowardly, a rejection of pacifism. Life is permanent warfare, contempt for weakness, a cult of heroism, hypermasculinity, a selective populism relying on chauvinist definitions of the people that it claims to speak for, a heavy use of newspeak, impoverished vocabulary, elementary syntax, and a resistance to complex and critical reasoning. If that's not Donald Trump on the world scene, I don't know who it is.
Boy, that just sounds like it was written to describe him.
It certainly does. And this is Umberto Eco writing in 1995, reflecting on his own experiences growing up in Italy under Mussolini.
Mm.
So you start out with this character. And by the way, people like Trump move from one position politically to another, just as Mussolini. You know, and the fascist leaders themselves go through a period of growth and regression, so that if we can say that Donald Trump displays fascist tendencies today, he may not always have displayed them in a full-blown fashion in the past. And you can think of Mussolini, who began his political career as a socialist and an editor of a newspaper that later, when he created the black shirts, ransacked. So people do change and they evolve, and the 14 characteristics that I just recited now fit Donald Trump almost to a T, as we've already noted. So you have to ask, I think, and this is the question that I addressed, how is it possible in the world's greatest democracy for a person who has these fascist impulses and goals in terms of his aggrandizement and the concentration of power in the presidency, how does he come to office in a great democracy? And if you study fascism around the world, you see that many fascist leaders come to power not by means of extrajudicial activity, not from attacks from the outside on the state, but by using the law that's already in place, by exploiting its weaknesses. And so that's why I ticked down and chose these 9 major aspects, or loopholes, as I call them, in our democracy for a person who really is a demagogue and who doesn't represent the majority's interests to come to power. And I started out with the Electoral College. Here we have a system for electing the President of the United States, which allows for the President to be elected by a minority of the popular vote. And Donald Trump lost the popular vote by 2.8 million. Unless, of course, you buy into his fantastic theory that those 2.8 million votes were cast by undocumented immigrants. So I think that's the biggest hole. And another one is the constitutional design of the Senate, with each state getting 2 senators, regardless of the size of their population. And that allows for the Senate to be controlled essentially by a minority party, and the Senate, together with a minority president, control presidential appointees. So you can have all sorts of appointments to the judicial branch of government, cabinet posts, et cetera, and so forth. And then when you add to that the president's power to issue executive orders, to invoke the National Emergencies Act, to exploit the draconian structure of our immigration statutes, and these were in place long before Donald Trump came to power, you have the makings of a fascistic chief executive. And that's what I wanted to bring out in the article.
Keep going. Tell us more about fascistic executive.
So, you know, you can augment all of that with the other remaining features that I noted, the growth of the Department of Homeland Security into a police force. DHS is now the 3rd largest federal agency in terms of total employees. And as we saw in Portland, the 60,000 law enforcement officials that work for DHS can be deployed very rapidly from city to city to control unrest and to intervene in protests that involve the exercise of First Amendment rights. And this really scared a lot of people and caused many of them to start to use the F word to describe Donald Trump. Then you have the use and abuse of the pardon power, and really sounds now like a banana republic. If you're one of Donald's friends, you get a pardon or you get a commutation. This morning, Steve Bannon was just arrested.
I was about to bring him up, yeah.
So what can we expect? Donald Trump got on TV, and as far as I remember, just looking at it briefly, saying, well, I don't really know him all that well. This is the same old routine that he pulled with Paul Manafort. He knows Steve Bannon all too well. Steve Bannon was the architect of his 2016 campaign. So will Steve Bannon get a pardon? And what does that say?
Pretty high.
What does that say about the state of our country? And then when you add to that the erosion of Department of Justice independence, which I write is not a law. There's no reason why the president legally can't direct prosecutions brought by the DOJ. Really, it's a norm. It's a value that we have respected as a country since Watergate, when John Mitchell was the Attorney General, and he and Nixon colluded on many different projects together. And then you throw in the ninth point I made on voter suppression, and now you have various techniques which have been in place for a long time and were accelerated by the Supreme Court in 2013 with the Shelby County decision, which essentially gutted the Voting Rights Act. And now you've added to that the president's ability to control the budget of the post office, which will be so important in terms of delivering mail-in ballots during the pandemic in the 2016 election, and you have a prescription for continued minority rule. And I end on a very sobering note. If we think things are bad now and they're moving in a fascist direction, imagine what 4 more years of Donald Trump's administration. Sorry about that. I'm working in my wife's office. And
Okay, go ahead.
All right, so I end on a sobering note. And just imagine if you think we're moving in a fascistic direction now, what 4 more years of Donald Trump, unbridled by the need to be reelected, would mean for the country. Here you have a man who says he's floating the idea that he can suspend the election, he can have a do-over, and he's even floated the idea that maybe he shouldn't be limited to 2 terms in office. Maybe because he's had such a hard time with all of these elites attacking him during his first term, he should be entitled to an additional term in office. That's truly dangerous. So we're at a crossroads in American history. And I think we have to face up to that fact. And using the F word to describe him, fascism, I think describes the great stakes that we face. And I think that it's time that we no longer shy away from using that term. And we don't just use it in an emotional sense. I stay away from using the word to describe policies and people that I just don't care for. Fascism does have a history. It is real. And if you look at the classic definitions of the term, a strong argument can be made that Donald Trump has become a fascist. Jason Stanley, a philosophy professor at Yale who writes on fascism, calls Trump's fascism performative fascism. In other words, that he hasn't perfected it yet, but that he's performing fascism. I think that's kind of a hair-splitting distinction, but nonetheless sets the table for a discussion of the term and how it applies to Donald Trump, his rhetoric, his base, and his policies.
So we need to take a brief break, and then when we come back, I'd like to have you talk about what the implications of this is.
Okay. How long a break?
That's it. My guest for this show is Bill Blum. He's a retired judge and a lawyer in Los Angeles. He's a lecturer at the University of Southern California Annenberg Center for Communication. He writes regularly on law and politics and is the author of 3 widely acclaimed legal thrillers: Prejudicial Error, The Last Appeal, and The Face of Justice. So we've been talking about Trump being a fascist. Recognizing that he is, how does that change things? How does it change the way we should be looking at him, the way the media should be looking at him, the way the legal system should be looking at him?
Well, I think it changes it in many ways. One of the issues around Donald Trump, and this applies across the political spectrum, is whether or not he's just another bad American president who mostly does things that are harmful for the country, but occasionally does some good things. You can think of criminal justice reform. He signed a sentencing bill, which is positive. I think Donald Trump has gone far beyond the bounds of that debate, and that it's high time for people to recognize the grave threat that he poses. And I think the fascist label helps frame that debate. And as you know, the framing of a debate is very important to the content of the debate and the outcome of any debate. So the question on the table for me is not just whether Donald Trump is a bad president, not just whether as an individual he's up for the job. Does he have the intellectual capability to be president? The question is whether or not Donald Trump and the movement he leads are something different, namely an American kind of fascism. And if that's true, people need to understand where we're going as a nation.
Do we have other history of fascism in the United States?
Well, we do. We have our fascist movements, and if you read the Sarah Churchwell article, she anchors her discussion of fascism in the resurgence of the KKK in the 1920s. Hitler was a great admirer of the Jim Crow South, and if you look at the discussions of the Ku Klux Klan during the 1920s, many people noted the similarities between the Klan and Mussolini's black shirts. And then, of course, you have the explicit fascist movements in the 1930s in the United States, the German-American Bund, later the formation of the Nazi Party. Those are fringe elements, the Nazi Party in the United States, but they are present. And now we have this swing throughout Europe to the right, with the rise of what can be called neo-fascist movements, the Popular Front in France, movements in Austria, movements in Hungary, Belarus. And I think it's important to put Donald Trump in the wider context of those movements. So I think that, yes, we do have American antecedents of Trump. Trump didn't spring out of thin air. Trump came from a place which does harken back to the rise of these right-wing ultra-nationalist movements. You have the decimation of the American middle class. You have white middle-class people who are threatened with loss of income, loss of jobs, working-class people, the same thing. And then you have overlayered with that anxiety a history of virulent racism in the United States, which as a country we still haven't come to terms with. And I think that that's a volatile mix rooted in our history, and that mix has produced Donald Trump.
And I think that this has had a domino effect. I mean, what we're seeing, these other places that you've described, some of them were around before, but I think Trump has also helped to set up like a template for other nations, like in Brazil with Bolsonaro as well.
Absolutely. The Trump of the tropics.
Yeah. I mean, so what he's doing is setting an example, a horrible example, using the United States, really.
That's right. Trump has an affinity for other dictators around the world and a revulsion for democracies around the world. And you can get into his history, his psychology, and his receptivity to that sort of demagoguery. You can read his niece's book. You can read studies on his psychology. There are many of those out there. And all of that just reinforces the notion that this man, to quote him, is what it is. And he's not going to change.
Yeah. All right, so I want to move into another topic. You wrote another article, The Constitution is Not a Suicide Pact, or also titled, No, the Constitution Doesn't Protect Coronavirus Deniers. We've got millions of people denying coronavirus, going out in the streets, carrying big automatic weapons, protesting at capitals. What's your take on all of this? And there are lawsuits going on.
Well, I think it's complicated. We have a country that is based on individual liberty being defined as freedom from government control. And that tradition is embodied in the Bill of Rights. You have freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, et cetera, and so forth, the right to protest. At the same time, we're faced with a grave public health crisis, the biggest public health crisis since the 1918 Spanish flu, not the 1917 Spanish flu, as Donald keeps reminding us incorrectly. So those two needs have to be balanced some way. And the phrase, the Constitution is not a suicide pact, comes from a 1949 decision, actually from a dissenting opinion written by Robert Jackson, who incidentally headed the Nuremberg trials, took the leave from the Supreme Court to do that. And what it means, as applied to the coronavirus, is that the denial of the dangers of COVID-19 cannot be allowed to supersede the reality and the science that the virus exists and that it poses grave threats to all of us. So we won't have a constitution if we're suffering from pandemics that threaten literally our lives. So I think that in this clash between the desire to be free from restrictions of containing coronavirus and the need to contain the virus, that the principle that the Constitution isn't a suicide pact, and that simply because people don't want to comply with wearing masks, that desire should not take priority in the current environment. And the restrictions, well, let's be clear, wearing a mask doesn't mute your ability to protest. It's a very simple thing. We're required now to wear seatbelts in cars. It's really not all that different from wearing a mask when you're in a public gathering. So the idea that these laws or these orders that come down from governors and mayors that you shall wear masks if you're in a store, if you're in a place of business, I think that they're entirely lawful. And for the most part, they're being upheld across the country.
Now, there's one case I know in California where a minister of a big megachurch has violated those orders and has been having thousands of people go in the church and they're singing, which singing makes things worse. And where does that fit into it with freedom of religion and what have you?
Well, that's one of the liberties that you have under the First Amendment. But remember, no right under the Bill of Rights is absolute. First Amendment rights are subject to reasonable regulation as to time, place, and manner. That's also bedrock black letter First Amendment law. So the right of people to worship isn't going to be eliminated by these mitigation requirements, but it is going to be regulated. Now, what happens if the church continues openly to violate the mitigation regulations? That's a good question. I don't anticipate that people will be arrested en masse. I think that this is a function of a failure of our education system, and to get back to Donald Trump, a failure of the presidency to educate the public and to hammer home the dangers that COVID-19 poses, and the need for everyone to pitch in to tamp down the virus so that we can get past the virus, and so that you can resume worshiping in these large settings with large gatherings, just as you'd like to do. I think that if Donald Trump had done what Andrew Cuomo did when New York was facing its most dangerous times, I think we'd be in a different place today with these COVID deniers.
And a lot less dead people. What about Ty?
Fewer dead people. Sorry?
Now, people are saying that these orders are fascist.
That the orders are fascist. Well, they're going to say that the orders are fascist because they restrict their liberties. And honestly, I have to reject that, because their right to speak, their right to protest is not being eliminated, but reasonable regulation has always been recognized under the Constitution. And when you think about it, what are we asking people to do? We're asking people, when they can, to socially distance, which means staying 6 feet apart. And we're telling them to wear masks. And we're telling them, if you don't have to go out, it's safer to remain at home. But I don't know that anyone's being arrested simply for violating those regulations. So I can't think of them as fascistic. On the other hand, I do think that what is fascist-like, and we just read those 14 principles from Umberto Eco, is science denial, attacks on the press, attacks on the elites, such as medical professionals like Dr. Fauci. That's coming in from Donald Trump. And that, to me, seems more fascistic. And along with that, you have Donald Trump's embrace of quack cures for coronavirus, quick fixes like hydroxychloroquine or oleander flower. That's the latest one that's coming down.
All right. Well, I promised to keep this to a half an hour. You've been great. Really appreciate it. My guest for this show has been Bill Blum. He's a retired judge and a lawyer in Los Angeles, a lecturer at the University of Southern California, Annenberg, and he writes regularly on law and politics and is the author of 3 widely acclaimed legal thrillers, Prejudicial Error, The Last Appeal, and The Face of Justice. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.